I think I just stumbled upon one of the quietest laws of human existence. A law that changes the way we read every single day of our own lives. And right now, you're probably a little confused. Because if you look around, you'll find someone who seems to be in charge of everything. Of their career, of their body, of the people around them, of the future. But that's a lie. The truth is that depending on how many things you try to hold on to at the same time, your life might be being run by anything and everything except you. And believe me when I say this realization will quietly shatter the way you see every effort you've ever made. But I have to confess something. I lied a little. Technically, you were never in control. And that's precisely why the next few minutes might change the way you breathe. Just look around. Never before in history have so many technical resources been available to the average person. Apps that organize your schedule down to the last minute. Devices that measure heart rate, sleep, blood pressure, steps, calories. Tools that project finances decades into the future. Services that predict traffic, weather, market trends. And yet, mental burnout rates keep climbing. Psychiatric appointments keep multiplying. And beneath that statistical curve, there's something no graph can show. People feel less and less in control of the very life they're living. There's something deeply wrong with this equation, and the error isn't in the technology. It's in the premise that technology carries with it. The idea that, if you measure and control everything, you'll finally be at peace. That premise is false, and it's under the weight of it that millions of modern lives are being quietly consumed. There was, in an old village on the edge of a cold northern European sea, a man who devoted his entire life to reinforcing a dike. He woke up before the sun, hauled stones, mixed clay, stacked wood. The sea was a constant enemy, a daily threat to his lands. Every wave that pushed a few meters further was a source of anguish. Every storm, a war. The man grew old there, hunched over, with cracked hands, and he spent so many years staring at the horizon and fearing the advance of the water that he forgot to look inside his own home. His children grew up without him noticing. His wife grew tired of waiting for a worry-free dinner. When he finally stopped, already old, he sat down on the sand and looked at the sea. The sea was still there, indifferent, the same size, with the same waves. And he realized, far too late, that he had spent an entire lifetime fighting something that had never been interested in him at all. That parable is ancient, but it describes with terrible precision what most people do without ever noticing. There are forces in life that don't bend to our will, not because they're evil, not because they hate us, simply because we were never built to bend them. And fighting them is spending your own existence in an impossible battle, while what really matters slips by unnoticed right beside you. There's a story, almost 1,000 years old, about a king named Canute the Great, who reigned over England, Denmark, and Norway in the early 11th century. It's said that his courtiers were constantly flattering him, telling him his power was limitless, that he could command even the elements. One day, tired of the flattery, Canute asked them to carry his throne down to the beach. He sat there, facing the sea, with his courtiers gathered around him, and ordered the waves to stop, to not wet his royal feet. The waves, as you'd expect, did not obey. They rose, they touched his shoes, they soaked his robes. And Canute turned to his courtiers and said something that was recorded in the medieval chronicles. No king has power over nature. The true king is above, and before him all men are equal. That story is remembered in a twisted way by a lot of people. They think Canute was arrogant, that he was trying to prove his power. But it was exactly the opposite. He wanted to teach his men, and himself, that there are limits no crown ever crosses. Recognizing what you don't control isn't defeat. It's a rare form of clarity. It's the beginning of a deeper intelligence about life itself. The Greek philosopher Epictetus, who was born a slave in the 1st century and became one of the greatest masters of Stoicism, had a life that needs to be remembered before you read a single word he wrote. He was brought to Rome as a child, bought as property, and spent a good part of his life in servitude. A tradition preserved by the Greek philosopher Celsus, a younger contemporary of Epictetus, and quoted centuries later by Origen of Alexandria in his treatise Contra Celsum, tells us that his master, in a fit of rage, went so far as to twist his leg until it broke. Epictetus, according to this account, looked at the man without screaming and simply warned him that, if he kept going, the leg would snap. When it finally did, he reportedly said, without ever raising his voice, that he had warned him. Truth or legend, the scene says something important about the man who later wrote about control. He knew, in his own flesh, what it was like to have power over almost nothing. He knew what it was like to belong to someone else. He knew what it was like to have his body at the mercy of another's will. And it was precisely because he knew all of this that he discovered, deeper than any free man of his era, where the one territory lay that no master could ever invade. It was inside. It was in his judgment. It was in his internal response. After being freed, Epictetus opened a school of philosophy, first in Rome and then in Nicopolis, in Greece, after the Emperor Domitian expelled the philosophers from the capital. His lectures were not written down by him. They were recorded by a student named Arrian, who preserved his teachings in two texts, the Discourses and a small handbook, the Enchiridion, which literally translates to something you carry in your hand, a pocketbook for quick reference. And it's in the very first sentence of that portable manual that he wrote something that should be posted on the door of every home. He said, in the opening line of that book, something so direct that it almost gets lost in its own simplicity. He said that some things depend on us and others do not. That distinction seems obvious. It's the most obvious thing in the world, and it's precisely because it's obvious that almost no one takes it seriously. People spend their lives getting furious at traffic, at the weather, at the opinions of strangers, at decisions made by distant governments, at the behavior of adult family members, at the results of elections on other continents. And each one of those bursts of fury is a piece of life spent trying to move what does not move. Epictetus taught that human suffering almost never comes from things themselves. It comes from attachment to them. It comes from the demand that reality be different from what it is. When someone demands that the weather be different, they suffer. When someone demands that another person think differently, they suffer. When someone demands that their own body not age, they suffer. Suffering settles in the narrow gap between what you think should happen and what actually happens. The wider that gap, the greater the pain. And the hardest part is that this gap is created by us, every single day, without us even realizing it. Think of a man who's expecting his boss to acknowledge the work he's been doing for months. He walks into the room carrying that expectation. He's waiting for a sentence, a compliment, a nod. The boss walks past, distracted, and says nothing. Another man, in the exact same situation, without that loaded expectation, would have gone through the day at peace. But the first one leaves the room with his body tense, his thoughts on loop, his head replaying the scene, imagining what could have gone wrong. The boss didn't do anything. The pain didn't come from the boss. It came from the distance between what he expected and what happened. It came from the gap. That gap exists everywhere. It exists when someone texts another person and the message goes unanswered for hours. It exists when the kids grow up and don't make the choices their parents pictured. It exists when the country you love seems to be heading in a direction you don't approve of. It exists when your own reflection in the mirror doesn't match the internal image you have of yourself. In every one of those situations, the suffering isn't in the raw fact. It's in the silent demand that the raw fact be something else. And that demand, when you examine it up close, always reveals the same structural flaw, the attempt to control what doesn't belong to the domain of the one who's suffering. There are things that depend on you, your choices, your judgments, your attention, what you do with the time you have, how you respond to an insult, how you interpret a loss, how you use your body while it's still working. That's yours. That's sovereign territory. And there are things that don't depend on you. what other people think, what other people do, what the market decides, what your body, over the years, decides to do on its own, the weather, death, public opinion, the passing of time. None of that is in your hands, no matter how tightly you clench your fingers. The modern mistake, and it's a mistake that contemporary psychology identifies with pretty clear evidence in studies on generalized anxiety, is to confuse these two territories. People pour infinite energy into what they cannot change and neglect the little that they actually can. They lie awake at night over a comment made by someone they don't even like, and they can't spend 15 minutes a day cultivating something that truly belongs to them. It's a tragic inversion. It's a subterranean waste of existence. And here we get to the heart of what needs to be said, to the paradox that gives this reflection its name. When you try to control something that's outside of your reach, a very curious thing happens. You hand your peace over to that object. It starts to dictate your mood. It starts to decide whether you'll sleep or not. It starts to control your face, your voice, your energy, your lightness. What you wanted to master masters you. What you wanted to place under your power now has absolute power over you. That's why the phrase that gives this video its title isn't just a play on words. It's a silent law of the inner life. Ancient history offers a dramatic example of this phenomenon, and it's recorded with precision in Plutarch's parallel lives. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus in the 3rd century before Christ, was one of the most ambitious generals in the Greek world. He was planning to invade Italy, conquer Rome, and then expand his dominion across the entire Mediterranean. Before setting out, he had a conversation with his advisor Cineas, a learned man, a disciple of the orator Demosthenes. Cineas asked the king what he planned to do after conquering Rome. Pyrrhus answered that he would take Sicily, and after that, Cineas asked. After that, said Pyrrhus, he would take Carthage and all of Africa. And after that, the advisor insisted. After that, said Pyrrhus, he would finally rest, drink wine with his friends, and talk to his heart's content. Cineas then looked at the king and asked the question that, according to Plutarch, left the room without an answer for a long while. But that, my lord, we can already do right now. This scene contains an exact psychological truth. The ambition for absolute control indefinitely postpones the very thing it pretends to be chasing. It's a thirst that grows the more you drink, and it consumes the man himself from the inside, even while he appears to be consuming the world. Think about how many people you know who spent years trying to control other people's opinions and ended up hostage to those opinions. Who spent years trying to control their body until the body became a prison. Who spent years trying to control their partner and lost every trace of genuine love, because love doesn't survive surveillance. Who spent years trying to control their child and watched that child grow up and walk away without ever looking back. Every attempt to control what cannot be controlled creates an invisible contract. You squeeze, and what you squeeze squeezes you back. Seneca, another foundational name in Roman Stoicism, wrote letters to a friend named Lucilius during the final years of his life. He served as an advisor to the Emperor Nero, lived at the heart of power, and knew firsthand the intrigue, the fear, the permanent instability that surrounds anyone who lives close to tyrants. In the end, he was condemned to death by the very emperor he had counseled for years. He wrote his deepest letters precisely when he knew the noose was tightening. These are not the texts of a peaceful man in favorable circumstances. They are the texts of a man who learned to cultivate peace under impossible circumstances. And that practical origin gives weight to every single line. In one of those letters, letter number 13, he made an observation that crossed 2,000 years and arrived here intact. He said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And that phrase, as simple as it is, describes with precision the mental routine of the modern man. He wakes up in the middle of the night, worried about something that might never happen. He replays conversations that are already over and can't be redone. He imagines catastrophic scenarios with a richness of detail that reality rarely delivers. And in doing so, he consumes the energy of the day before the day has even begun. Seneca practiced an exercise the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the the premeditation of evils, not as pessimism, but as preparation. The idea was to spend a few minutes each day imagining what could go wrong, not to become paralyzed, but to strip future events of their power to surprise. Someone who has already thought calmly about a possible loss is not destroyed when it arrives. Someone who has already considered that a project might fail doesn't lose their footing when it does. The subtle difference between premeditation and panic is that premeditation ends in a calm realization. If it happens, I will still be me, and I will still know what to do. Panic, on the other hand, is a loop with no exit. It's the same catastrophic scene replaying in your head over and over, building nothing, just burning energy. The man who tries to armor the future against every unexpected event, without that internal discipline, ends up living in a future that hasn't arrived yet. And the price of that is enormous. It's the present that gets paid, the entire present. While he plans, cross-references data, projects, anticipates, calculates, and reworks scenarios, the actual day is happening somewhere without him. The afternoon sunlight comes through the window, and no one is there to see it. The face of someone he loves passes right in front of him without really being noticed. Meals get swallowed without flavor. The walk to the car happens on autopilot. The attempt to control tomorrow turns today into a ghost. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome in the 2nd century, wrote for himself, and not for publication, a notebook of reflections we now know as the Meditations. He ruled between the years 161 and 180 of the Common Era, and much of his reign coincided with one of the most brutal episodes in ancient history, the so-called Antonine Plague, which is estimated to have killed between 5 and 10 million people across the empire. Historians today believe it was likely a smallpox outbreak brought back from the east by Roman troops. Entire cities were devastated, legions lost half their forces, peasants died in the fields, and in the middle of all of it, the emperor kept writing by candlelight inside his campaign tent, reminders to himself about how to keep his soul serene. He was the most powerful man in the known world. He commanded armies, dictated laws, decided the life and death of millions. And even so, the recurring theme in his private notes was just one: to remember that he controlled almost nothing, to remember that illness could arrive, to remember that betrayal could happen, to remember that death was certain, to remember that people's opinions of him were volatile and said nothing about who he really was. And it was precisely that daily awareness that kept him standing. It was that clarity about the limits of his own power that made him a serene man in the middle of a chaotic existence. Accepting what happens isn't passivity. That has to be repeated, because modern culture confuses the two. There's an enormous difference between apathetic resignation and lucid consent. The apathetic one gives up because they've lost hope. The lucid one consents because they've seen reality clearly and chosen not to burn their strength where it has no effect at all. One surrenders to the world. The other allies with reality so they can spend their strength where it actually makes a difference. Marcus Aurelius wasn't passive. He governed an empire during a plague, a war, and a string of crises. But he did it from an internally pacified place, and it was from that solid ground that his decisions grew, without the trembling of a man wrestling against his own fate. And this is where the story starts to get strange, because if the Romans already knew this 2,000 years ago, and if philosophy was capable of describing the mechanism of human suffering with such precision, there's an uncomfortable question that has been waiting for an answer for centuries. If the way out has always been written down, why does almost nobody walk through it? Hold on to that question. It will come back later, and not with the answer you're expecting. It's striking that, on the other side of the world, centuries earlier, a Chinese tradition arrived at surprisingly similar conclusions through completely different paths. Taoism, with Lao Tzu in the 6th century before Christ, and Zhuangzi in the 4th, developed a wisdom of non-resistance that sounds as if it had been written as a response to Stoicism, even though the two never actually crossed paths. Zhuangzi, in particular, is a delightful author to read. He wrote in short parables, almost philosophical jokes, showing characters who refused to take seriously what society took seriously, and who took seriously what society threw away. He once said he dreamed he was a butterfly, and upon waking, no longer knew whether he was a man dreaming of being a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming of being a man. That apparent joke contains a serious provocation. If you don't know exactly what you are or where your fixed identity comes from, why do you spend so much energy defending it against the world? There's an old story from Chinese Taoism that perfectly complements what the Stoics were teaching, even though it was born on the other side of the world. It's the parable of the old farmer. A peasant had one horse, and that horse was the tool of his livelihood. One day the horse ran off. The neighbors came to lament with him. "What terrible luck," they said, and he simply answered, "Who knows?" A few days later, the horse came back, bringing several wild horses along with it. The neighbors came to congratulate him. "What incredible luck," they said. And he answered again, "Who knows?" The farmer's son, trying to tame one of the new horses, fell and broke his leg. The neighbors came back. "What a tragedy," they said. "Who knows?" he answered. Weeks later, the army came through recruiting young men for a bloody war, and the son, because of the broken leg, was spared. The neighbors came one last time. "What a blessing," they said. "Who knows?" he answered. That story says a lot. It says that the events of life don't end when they appear to end. That what today dresses itself up as tragedy might tomorrow be a blessing in disguise. That what today looks like good fortune might hold within it a future pain. And that judging too quickly is a form of existential nearsightedness. Taoism doesn't ask you to be indifferent. It asks you to suspend immediate judgment, because you rarely have enough information to know what any given event really means within the whole arc of your life. Lao Tzu, the legendary thinker credited with the authorship of the Tao Te Ching, a small book written perhaps in the 6th century before Christ, introduced a concept that is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Eastern thought. That concept is Wu Wei. Translated literally as non-action, it seems to suggest passivity, laziness, giving up. But it's none of that. Wu Wei is the action that flows with the nature of things, instead of forcing them into a mold. It's action without unnecessary effort. It's acting at the right time, in the right place, in the right way, without violence against reality. The Tao Te Ching uses an image that sticks in the mind of anyone who reads it carefully. That image is water. Water is the softest thing in the world. It yields to any resistance. It takes the shape of the container. It flows around the rock instead of trying to break it. And yet, over time, it's water that bores through stone. It's water that carves canyons. It's water that erodes mountains. The force of water isn't in hardness, it's in calm persistence. In the patience of continuing on its way without fighting whatever stands in the middle. There's a famous verse in the Tao Te Ching, in chapter 78, that says nothing in the world is softer or more fragile than water, and yet no force can defeat it in the long run. That claim seems paradoxical until you actually watch a real river. A river doesn't argue with the rock. It goes over, under, through the pores, along the side. It just goes. And as it goes, it carries the material with it. One day, centuries later, the rock isn't there anymore. Not because the water attacked it, because the water insisted on being water. There's an enormous difference between the person who learns from that image and the person who doesn't. The one who learns stops banging their head against closed doors. They go around. They wait for the right moment. They use the weight of the situation to their advantage, instead of trying to lift it from scratch. The one who doesn't learn keeps trying to break through, and they're astonished at the end of their life that they've come so far without arriving anywhere at all. Compare that to the rigidity of someone who wants to force life to fit into their plans. The rigid one breaks. The rigid one burns their strength on every corner, every unexpected turn, every change. The rigid one reaches the end of the day exhausted and the end of life bitter, because nothing turned out exactly the way they wanted, and nothing ever turns out exactly the way you want. That's one of the oldest laws of the universe, and no amount of planning is going to change it. Alan Watts, the British philosopher who lived in the 20th century and devoted much of his work to translating Eastern thought for a Western audience, wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity, published in 1951. The central thesis of that book is a hard pill to swallow. Watts argues that the obsessive search for security is itself the origin of modern insecurity. The more we try to freeze life into something predictable, the more we feel it slipping away. Because life is movement, by definition. It's flow. And trying to hold on to it is like trying to grip water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze your fingers, the faster the water runs out. There's a moment in every inner journey when reading about an idea stops being enough. It's when thought demands a body and words demand a gesture. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. And if something here has already moved something inside you, the next step starts with the link I've left in the first pinned comment. That's where this conversation stops being a video you watched and starts becoming a path you walk. There's a familiar sensation for many people. That instant when the bill arrives in your email, the number pops up on the screen, and your stomach sinks. There's also the blue glow of the phone on your face at 3 in the morning, checking notifications no one asked to receive. There's the exhaustion of Friday traffic, that silence inside a stopped car that reveals more about a person's life than any therapy session. All of those little moments are fragments of the same desperate attempt to be in charge, to predict, to armor yourself, to not get caught off guard. And yet, the surprise still comes. It always comes, not in the way you expected, but in some other way. Life has a strange sense of humor, and it consists in breaking exactly the certainties that cost us the most to build. There's a psychological observation that contemporary research confirms. Studies published over the past few decades by institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States show that anxiety disorder rates have been climbing steadily since the end of the 20th century, especially among young adults in developed economies. It isn't a lack of resources. It's an excess of options, an excess of information, an excess of constant simulation of the future. The mind, when exposed to an infinite quantity of possible scenarios, starts treating each of them as if it were imminent. And that's exhausting in a way that human beings of previous generations never experienced at the same intensity. Watts noticed something interesting about modern culture. He said that the more resources we have to protect ourselves, the more scared we become. The more information we have about risks, the more paralyzed we get. The more options we have, the more anxious we feel. The abundance of possibilities, far from bringing peace, produces a constant vertigo. And that vertigo is the backdrop of a huge portion of the adult population today. It's not necessarily clinical depression, it's a diffuse restlessness, a persistent feeling that something is wrong, that you need to hold on tighter, control better, prevent more. But the more you hold on, the less you live. The more you control, the emptier the day becomes. Because life is precisely in what escapes, in what surprises, in what cannot be predicted. A delicious dinner is made of flavors you didn't know you were going to taste. A memorable conversation is made of turns nobody saw coming. Real love is made of space for the other person to be their own person, and not a projection of yours. When you try to control everything, you kill everything. Life, in order to be life, needs room to be unpredictable. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the 19th century American essayist, wrote in 1841 a text that changed American intellectual culture and is still being read today. Emerson was one of the founders of the movement called Transcendentalism, a philosophical and literary current that flourished in Concord, Massachusetts, and brought together authors like Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller. They wanted to give the American individual back a kind of inner sovereignty that the culture of the time, still very much attached to European standards and institutional religion, had hollowed out. The text is called Self-Reliance. Emerson was concerned with a specific kind of slavery he saw around him: slavery to other people's opinions. Brilliant men were wasting their talents out of fear of what the neighbors might think, and intelligent women were hiding their ideas so they wouldn't seem strange, while an entire society ran on a collective approval that no one had the courage to challenge. There's a famous line from Emerson in that same essay that says imitation is suicide, and it isn't rhetorical provocation. It's a precise description of a psychic dynamic. When someone lives based on what others expect, when someone organizes their life around standards they didn't choose, that person is, quietly and daily, killing their own center. They might gain approval. They might gain social security. They might gain everything society offers to those who behave. But they lose the one thing that matters, which is contact with themselves. And Emerson's proposal was radical. He said that the only fortress no one can invade is your own character. That anyone who depends on approval, on public success, on the gaze of others, lives in a sandcastle at the mercy of the first wave. That trusting yourself isn't arrogance. It's the only sane way to exist in a world that will always try to tell you who you are. Emerson called man back into himself, back to the only territory where sovereignty is real, back to the only place where no one, ever, can invade without your permission. And that connects with what the Stoics had already been saying 1800 years earlier. Real power isn't out there. It never has been. It's in the narrow space between what happens to you and how you respond. In that small interval, you're free. In that interval, you're king. Outside of it, you're always at the mercy of something else. And most people spend their entire lives without ever discovering that interval, without ever realizing it exists, without ever stepping into that small piece of inner sovereignty. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology in the early 20th century, illuminated a dimension the ancients had only touched on from a distance. Jung was a disciple of Freud for years, and then broke with him because he believed the human psyche had deeper layers than the Freudian model could account for. He spent his life investigating those layers. He worked with severely ill patients, studied comparative mythology, ancient religions, medieval alchemy, the dreams of thousands of people. And it was from that enormous investigation that he extracted concepts like the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and, especially relevant to this reflection, the shadow. Jung observed, over decades of clinical practice, that the obsessive impulse to control the external world almost always hides a deep fear of the internal world. People who need to order every detail of their environment, every movement of the people around them, every outcome, every scenario, are frequently people carrying an inner chaos they refuse to look at. External control is an attempt to compensate for internal disorder, an attempt that never works, by the way, because the inner life doesn't heal through external organization. Jung talked about the shadow, which is the sum of everything a person denies in themselves, everything they don't want to acknowledge, everything they push down to the bottom of consciousness because they find it unacceptable. And he said that mature psychological work, the only kind that brings any real peace, is the work of integrating that shadow. It's looking at what exists inside you that you don't like and recognizing that it's part of you. It's realizing that you too are capable of rage, of pettiness, of envy, of weakness. Not so you'll act on it, but so you can stop spending energy denying it. Whoever denies the shadow spends their life policing the world. Whoever integrates the shadow starts to live. The paradox of control, therefore, has an inner root. The person who most needs to control is the one who is most afraid of themselves. And as long as they don't look inward, they'll keep gripping the world with more and more force, and the world will keep slipping away, and they'll stay exhausted, and the cycle will never break. The way out isn't learning a better time management technique or a more efficient organizational methodology. The way out is beginning to look inward. The way out is integration. The way out is making peace with your own chaos before trying to impose order on someone else's. Think of a couple in which one partner constantly checks the other's phone. On the surface, it's a matter of trust. But if it's examined honestly, it's rarely about the other person. It's about an old wound in the person doing the checking, a wound they've never looked at directly, a feeling of not being enough, of possibly being abandoned, of needing to keep watch so they won't be caught off guard. Each check eases the anguish for about 2 minutes. And on the third minute, the anguish comes back worse, because the anguish wasn't living in the phone, it was living inside, and it won't go away with any password cracked. It'll only go away when that person has the courage to look at what created it, and that courage is one of the rarest there is. There's something even harder to acknowledge, and maybe this is the most existential moment of this video. Not even our own body fully belongs to us. It gets sick without asking permission. It ages without consulting our schedule. It dies in the end, at the moment it decides to die, and not at the moment we planned. There's a billion-dollar industry dedicated to denying this. It runs from the jar of cream on the shelf to the longevity protocol sold at the clinic, passing through the cosmetic surgery that promises to give you back 10 years and the supplement that promises to give you back your youth. None of that is bad in itself. The issue is what's hiding underneath the consumption of those products. A deep refusal to accept that the body is temporary. And that refusal, when it becomes the center of someone's life, turns time in front of the mirror into a permanent tribunal, where the person condemns themselves over every new line that appears. Epictetus taught something that sounds harsh at first, but, once understood, sets you free. He said we should treat everything we have, including the body, as a loan, not as property. You were given a body, a life, a stretch of time, and you're going to give all of that back. The question isn't if, it's when. Facing that truth isn't morbid. It's the opposite of morbid. The one who runs from that truth is the one who becomes its prisoner. The one who avoids thinking about death is precisely the one who fears it most. The one who pretends the body will last forever is the one who suffers the most when it starts to fail. The Stoic tradition insisted on an exercise called memento mori, remember death. The Latin expression has become a cliché in modern self-help books, but it comes from a serious practice, centuries and centuries older than those books. Medieval monks kept skulls on their study desks, not because they were fond of horror, but because they wanted to have, right in front of their eyes at all times, a physical reminder that this day could be the last, and that this awareness would change the way that day was lived. Not as a cult of the macabre, but as a source of clarity. If you remember every day that you're going to die, you'll spend your days with more care. You'll argue less over nonsense. You'll postpone less of what matters. You'll look at the people you love with different eyes. The awareness of finitude is the most powerful antidote to the fantasy of absolute control. And it's here, after everything that's been said, that we need to make the turn. Because an entire video about what you don't control could be depressing. It could feel like an invitation to passivity. But it isn't. It's exactly the opposite. Because once you stop spending your strength on what you cannot change, an enormous amount of energy is left over to invest in what you can. And it's at that point, exactly at that point, that life truly begins. What do you control then? You control your judgment, the way you interpret every event, the frame you place around the facts. The same situation can be read as catastrophe or as a lesson, as injustice or as opportunity, as the end of the world or as a chapter in a bigger story. And that reading, that interpretation, that frame is yours. Nobody can do that for you. Nobody can invade that space without your permission. You control your attention, where you put your eyes, your thoughts, your energy. And that might be the most decisive decision of modern life, in a world designed to steal attention around the clock. There's an entire global economy, with trillions of dollars in play, whose main product is human attention. Apps are engineered by teams of engineers to generate the maximum possible engagement, which means, in practice, to keep your eyes glued to the screen for the longest possible time. And what happens, without you noticing, is that attention, which is the scarcest and most valuable resource of any life, leaks out through those cracks without anyone knowing where it went. You can spend the whole day mentally replaying an insult you got last week, or you can direct your mind to something that builds. You can spend hours on your phone screen consuming bad news that changes nothing, or you can spend that same time reading a page of a book that will stay with you forever. Attention is the most valuable resource you have and the only one you distribute entirely on your own. Nobody can force you to look at anything. Nobody can force you to think about any specific thing. You might give in out of habit, Give in out of exhaustion, give in out of impulse, but every surrender is a choice. And each choice, repeated thousands of times over the course of a life, is what builds the mind you'll have at 70. Someone who spent decades feeding their mind with digital garbage arrives at the end of life with a mind full of garbage. Someone who spent decades feeding their mind with what builds arrives at the end of life with a rich inner world. This isn't a motivational speech. It's the math of accumulation. You control your response. What happens to you isn't your choice, but what you do with what happens is. It always is. An insult can trigger an impulsive reaction or a thoughtful pause. A loss can generate bitterness or depth. A difficulty can generate paralysis or movement. That margin of response is what Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps of World War II, described in his book Man's Search for Meaning, originally published in 1946. Frankl lost his wife, his parents, and his brother during the Holocaust. He spent years in Auschwitz and other camps. He saw everything a human being can see of the worst. And when he came out, he wrote a book that became one of the most widely read works of the 20th century. He saw, under the worst conditions a human being can face, that there was always one last freedom: the freedom to choose your own attitude in the face of circumstances. Men who had lost everything, who were hungry, cold, in pain, humiliated, still decided, in the privacy of their own inner selves, whether they would surrender to barbarism or hold on to some trace of humanity until the end. And that decision, said Frankl, was the last sovereign territory. Nobody, not even the cruelest guards, could tear that away from you. Only you yourself, if you decided to hand it over. But no external force had that power. You control your character, the kind of person you're becoming through every small decision no one sees. Aristotle, in the second book of his Nicomachean Ethics, written in the 4th century before Christ, said that character is formed by repetition, that we are what we do repeatedly, and that, therefore, excellence isn't an act, it's a habit. That means nobody becomes a person of integrity by accident, on one decisive day. Integrity is built over thousands of small days, in thousands of ordinary gestures, in thousands of quiet choices that no one is watching. That's why character is the only thing a person truly carries with them, because they themselves built it, brick by brick, over the years. The word you choose to say or not to say, the gesture you make or don't make, the promise you keep or break. Character is built without anyone hearing it, and nobody can build it for you. It's the one asset you carry with you at all times, even when you've lost everything else. That seems like little. It seems like little compared to the enormous list of things you don't control. But it's everything, because it's precisely in that small sovereign territory that a life gets decided. Not in the external events which come and go, but in the quality of the relationship you build with them. Two people can go through the same loss, and one comes out destroyed, while the other comes out transformed. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in what each one did with what happened. There's something curious about how the human mind evaluates situations. Two people watch the same scene, hear the same sentence, receive the same piece of news. One comes out transformed, the other comes out indifferent, a third comes out destroyed. The event is exactly the same. What changes is the inner filter of each person, the frame of meaning that each mind applies to what happened. That's an old observation that modern cognitive psychology, especially in the work of Aaron Beck starting in the 60s, converted into an entire therapeutic methodology. Cognitive therapy starts from exactly that premise. It isn't events that produce emotions, it's the interpretation of events. And when you work on the interpretations, emotional life transforms without a single external circumstance having to change. That's what the Stoics already knew 2,000 years ago, now confirmed by decades of clinical research. And it's good news, because it means that change is closer than most people imagine. You don't have to wait for circumstances to improve. You don't have to wait for other people to change. You can start today, inside your own head, with your own look at what's happening. And that, unlike a lot of things people promise out there, actually works. that changes the way you understand what strength means. Modern culture, especially American culture over the last few decades, has promoted an image of strength that is essentially an image of control. The strong one would be the one who dominates his own body until he deforms it, who dominates his own schedule until he burns it out, who dominates his subordinates, the market, the circumstances. That image is so dominant it's become almost invisible, and it's false. The truly strong person isn't the one who controls the world. It's the one who stays whole when the world moves. It's the one who doesn't fall apart when the plan fails. It's the one who doesn't lose their composure when they're unfairly criticized. It's the one who can sleep even with unpaid bills. It's the one who can be kind to someone who wasn't kind first. It's the one who can keep walking when they can't see the next curve. That kind of strength doesn't show up in the mirror. It shows up in the crisis. And it's the only kind that truly sustains a life. There's an old image from Eastern wisdom that illustrates this in a memorable way. In the storm, the rigid oak, proud of its hardness, resists the wind up to a certain point and then breaks. The roots tear through the earth, the trunk splits, the whole tree falls. The reed, right next to it, bends. It curves almost to the ground. A careless observer might say it surrendered. But when the storm passes, the reed stands up again, whole. The oak stays down. Rigidity, which looked like strength, was weakness in disguise. Flexibility, which looked like weakness, was true strength. That image, which shows up in La Fontaine's fables in the 17th century, and in Taoist texts much older than that, has survived so long because it tells a hard truth. Whoever doesn't know how to bend, breaks. And breaking is a one-way road. Meanwhile, the reed, every time it rises again after a storm, learns. Meanwhile, the oak, once fallen, simply rots. That's the inner resilience that replaces the fantasy of external mastery. It's not about not feeling. It's not about not suffering. It's about not breaking. It's about getting through. It's about continuing to be yourself, even when the circumstances try to rewrite you. That capacity to bend without breaking is what Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, called amor fati, the love of one's own fate. Nietzsche wrote that expression in books like The Gay Science and later in Ecce Homo. He said the formula for human greatness was exactly this: to want nothing to be different, not in the past, not in the future, not for all eternity, not merely to endure what life brings, but to love it, to love even what hurts, to love even what seems to have been unjust, to love because all of that together formed the person who now lives and breathes. This isn't resignation. It's the opposite. It's a lucid, almost fierce embrace of what life brings, with the certainty that you can keep standing in the middle of anything, and that your own personal history, with its folds and scars, is the only history you have, and therefore, it's the only one worth honoring. And maybe the last thing to say is this: the paradox of control resolves itself in a very simple gesture. Even though it's one of the hardest gestures to perform, it resolves itself in letting go. Not giving up, letting go. Two different things. Giving up is stopping trying to live. Letting go is stopping trying to hold on to what was never yours to hold. You aren't the owner of other people's opinions. Let go. You aren't the owner of tomorrow. Let go. You aren't the owner of the direction of the economy. Let go. You aren't the owner of how others will remember you after you're gone. Let go. Do, today, a very old and very effective exercise. Take a moment of silence, 10 minutes, and mentally list the things you've been trying to control, the big ones and the small ones. What you want that family member to understand. What you want that co-worker to notice. What you want to happen next quarter. What you want to avoid next year. List all of it. And then, look at each item on the list and ask yourself honestly, does this depend on me? Does this fit within my actual power? If it doesn't, put it back where it belongs. Give it back to reality. Give it back to life. It's not yours. It never was. There's a very important difference between letting go and dropping. Letting go is a conscious act. It's recognizing that something doesn't belong in your hands and returning it to its proper place. Dropping is distraction, laziness, giving up. The two look identical from the outside, and they're profoundly different on the inside. Whoever lets go keeps walking, keeps working, keeps engaging with life. They just stop carrying that weight that wasn't theirs to carry. Whoever drops usually drops themselves too. And they confuse the peace of someone who has let go with the apathy of someone who has surrendered. A practical example. A father worried about the professional direction of his adult son can spend years trying to control the son's choices. He can give advice that wasn't asked for. He can express silent disappointment. He can create bad moods during every visit. None of that changes the son. The son keeps making his own choices, now with the added weight of his father's disapproval. One day, that father might let go. Letting go doesn't mean he stops loving. It doesn't mean he stops caring. It means recognizing that the son is an adult, that the son's life belongs to the son, that the only real power the father has over that person is the quality of the bond they build together, and that this bond only holds up on respect. When the father lets go, usually the son comes back, not because he surrendered to fatherly authority, because he finds there, for the first time, a space where he doesn't have to defend himself. And in that space, affection can circulate again. And when you give it back, something strange will happen. A lightness, a space, an air that wasn't there before. Because every single thing you try to hold on to without being able to hold occupies internal space. Every worry that can't be solved consumes energy. When you let go, that energy comes back, and it comes back whole. And it comes back to be used on what actually fits within your power, on what you can do today, on what you can say now, on the person you can become tomorrow. There's a question worth carrying with you for a few days. It's not for answering quickly. It's for letting it echo like a background vibration. The question is this: if you removed from your life today every single battle you're fighting against what you can't change, what would be left? How much time? How much energy? How much attention? Probably an amount that's frightening. Because most people, when they do that math with themselves, realize that they spend the fattest slice of their week on friction that goes nowhere. Arguments that aren't going to convince anyone, worries that aren't going to prevent anything, guilt that isn't going to fix anything. When all of that energy gets redirected to what actually fits within your power, the result, over time, is a different life. Not because the circumstances changed, because the energy stopped leaking through holes that led nowhere. What you try to master controls you. That's the law. You squeeze and you get squeezed. You grip and you get gripped. If this reflection touched you in some way, leave a like so more people can find this content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reflections we're going to build together. And if you want to go deeper for real, to learn how to practice these ideas in your day-to-day life and walk in community with other people making this same inner journey, join our members club. That's where philosophy stops being a video you watched and starts being a life you live.